Hi everyone, Richard here at Kelvin Wazoo, bringing you another episode of the Genealogy of Music. So in this episode, I'm going to take a deep dive look at a South Korean musical artist, producer, who's probably one of the most famous musicians and songwriters, from South Korea. And he is considered the godfather of rock in South Korea. His name is Joong Hyun Shin. And here's a album of his that I'll be talking about here. So, typically, in Western countries, we introduce ourselves with our first name and then our family name. So you can see that it says here, Shin Joong Hyun. And so you might be thinking that Shin is his first name. No, that's his family name. Anyway, so we're talking about Joong Hyun Shin, who is 82 years old now and has quite an interesting story. He came from a very rough and hard scrabble background, living on the street for some time and doing what he could to get by and educate himself. Eventually became, as I said, one of the best known pop artists and singer-songwriters and psychedelic guitar player, in South Korea. However, he ran afoul of the Park regime in South Korea during the 70s. That was a dictatorship. And he ended up being imprisoned and tortured. And his music was banned for quite a while until Park was assassinated. He had been eventually released, but he couldn't get any work. And when Park was assassinated, then work started to happen, and there was a revival. So anyway, I want to go through and talk more about him. It's just a really amazing story. It would make a great biopic. So, hey, the Parasite director, Bong Joon-ho? You think so, huh? You think you might get on this? I think it would be a really, really good story. Just my thinking. When I first learned about Joong Hyun Shin with this album that I just picked up on a lark. This is with, all right, Shin Joong Hyun and the Yupjuns, okay? And I saw this in a record store, and it was talking about some really excellent psychedelic guitar, and I thought, all right, I'll give it a try, which was kind of a big risk because this wasn't inexpensive. I mean, it wasn't hugely expensive either, but still, it was a pretty big risk because I knew nothing about this. But they did have this like obi strip that provided some background information. And so this was later in his career during the mid-70s. And it would be a few years just before he gets arrested and imprisoned. And I really, really enjoyed this record. It is solid stuff. And you can certainly hear the musical influence, at least at this point in his career. I definitely hear Peter Green influence, Savoy Brown, and also 10 years after, I can hear that style of play and influence in his work. And there's definitely some Jimi Hendrix in there. In one of the songs, he seems to be doing a kind of quote of Third Rock from the Sun And is that it? Is that the, did I get the title of that Jimi Hendrix song right? Because now I'm thinking, oh, did you just name the TV show? But anyway, you hear him kind of quoting that song, but then it develops definitely into his own sound. And I'm sure there was some Syd Barrett influence going on in there, because he was definitely into the psychedelic guitar styles of these musicians and these bands. So I really, really liked this. And it was, quite a while before I saw anything else, ever turn up by him, until there's a eBay retailer who has some selections, that if you buy 3, then you're going to get 20% off, which is a pretty good deal, because the retail prices for many of these releases is decent. It's competitive. Even with, the shipping costs. The shipping cost was pretty minimal because it's a U.S. Vendor. But anyway, that's when I saw this being offered as part of that deal. So I bought some records, including this one. And this is an anthology of his work from 1958 up to 1974. And it's got little blurbs going in here with each of the songs so that you know a little bit about it. Because some of these songs are being performed by other musical artists, but they were songs that he wrote or he wrote and plays on, when they were recorded. And it also had this insert that really goes into biographical detail about his life. And like I said, it's a fascinating life. He was semi-orphan. I mean, at first he was born in Korea, 1938. So he was born in Korea, so before the division occurred. And then his mother died and his father remarried, and they traveled around a bit. They lived in Japan, they lived in China, and then he eventually found himself back in South Korea after the war, which was a really difficult time in Korea for, the Koreans. Not only was their country ravaged by war, their economy was pretty much obliterated. There was a lot of poverty. He describes in here about how his first encounter with American troops was when he saw this dump was set on fire by American troops who were at a base nearby. And this is where people would go and pick up scraps so that, they could eat. But that connection to the armed forces, U.S. Armed Forces, was pretty significant, because later on, that's who he started playing for, and playing Korean pop songs, but he also started listening to the Armed Forces Radio Network. And that's where he started hearing, American music. And he first started hearing Elvis Presley and many other musicians. And he kind of tried that on for a while. Interestingly, he worked really hard as a kid because his parents, his father, eventually they died also, I believe. So he was pretty much on his own, and he was working for a relative and living in their factory. They ran a pharmaceutical factory. So he would work and live there, and saved enough money to first buy a violin, but then he decided that really wasn't his style. Then later he bought a guitar, and that's, when things started happening. And he taught himself essentially how to play, listening to, Elvis Presley and then going into the early 60s, a lot of Mersey beat sound. But he tried the Elvis Presley look, but he decided it didn't suit him. And then he got hooked into jazz. And then the other big influence was soul. And you definitely hear it in the Yupjuns, because you've got this psychedelic funk and soul groove that's like really, really there. I mean, and it's not like he's being a magpie and mimicking and just parroting back these styles. He was influenced them, and he incorporates what he's hearing into his own playing with, some traditional Korean musical styles, thrown in. It's just really, really amazing work. So this is a really good album in that it's a double album, in that it covers his career starting in 1958. Early on, there's a vignette where he's playing with this band, and they had dancers, so he was like in the background, with the band. They weren't like up front center stage, the dancers were. And this incident happened during a show. They were playing for American servicemen. Someone yells out, hey, play a guitar solo, because guitar solos were, were starting to become more common. And he, of course, checked with the band leader first, being proper about that. If you're asking, can I do this? Could I try playing a guitar solo when we play for the troops? And the band leader said sure, and gave him a music book to study, which he did. And then the next time they played, he played this short guitar solo, and the troops apparently just went crazy, as in, this is great. And his band leader was so impressed, they raised his fee by 50%. Although, in comparable terms, he was still working for, like a couple dollars per gig or something like that. So the songs, some of these are performed. For example, the opens up here with a song called Moon Watching, which is performed by Shin, and was recorded in 1958. Then it goes through his career with these other groups that he was affiliated with, and also that he wrote music for. So you can, on the insert that comes with it, So in 1958, we've got Shin Joong Hyun, Haiki Shin. This is the record from 1958, and then there's another one that shows a record from 1970. But then we've got these other Korean pop artists such as Kim Jong-mi and Jang Hyun. All right, so he wrote songs, and in some cases performed, on their recordings, and also produced. He became a producer. He became so famous in the country, not just for his expertise with the guitar. Early on, he was giving guitar lessons. But he was also a music producer and was getting a lot of work. But, here that shows, photos of some of the bands. One of his first bands was the ADD4 in 1964. And you can kind of see, they were adopting the typical, like the Beatles and even the Rolling Stones and the Zombies and many of the other early and Mersey beat bands. They usually wore matching suits. Then there's also a photo of him, in 1979 playing guitar there. So this, I think, would be after his imprisonment. He had a band called the Golden Grapes. And then, of course, there's the Yupjuns. And here's another early one from 1958 where he's just jamming away on that Gibson. He was so popular and so sought after by many other musicians during the 60s and early 70s that, guess what? The ruling party, the dictatorship, asked him to do a song, and he declined, all right? So in 1972, this would have been pretty close to the peak of his career, the South Korean government asked him to write an ode to then President Park Chung-hee, who was, the ruling Republican dictator at that time, and he declined. And he ended up getting blacklisted. He found that studios wouldn't hire him anymore, or musicians would no longer seek him out, and studios would not record his music. He couldn't get gigs. In 1975, so this would have been right after the Yupjuns, because that was 1974, he got busted for marijuana. And the thing is, marijuana wasn't even illegal. What really ticked them off is that he saw the dictatorship as smothering the life out of Korea. And so he wrote this song that this anthology is named for, the last song, Beautiful Rivers and Mountains. And this was with Shin Joong Hyun and the Men. And so let me, read this to you about the song. He wrote this in 1972. I got a call from the Blue House. This is the government. They asked me to write a song to praise Park Chung-hee. After I declined the offer, I got another phone call from Park Chung-hee's Republican Party. I turned down the offer once again. After getting those two phone calls, I was heavy-hearted and couldn't focus on work. I went outside and wandering around and spent the next several days doing nothing. And then I wrote Beautiful Rivers and Mountains. So, and it is an amazing song. It is he wanted to write something that said that as a Korean, we couldn't be proud of who we are because of our natural resources. And so it was kind of taking a stab at the regime, and that's when they busted him for pot. He ended up being in prison for a while, where he endured water torture. He finally caved in and renounced his activities because he couldn't stand the torture anymore. And then they moved him into a mental institution where even some of the other mental patients in the hospital, when lucid, would tell people, let him go. He's not even mentally ill. Why is he here? And they kind of really broke him. Then he was released, back out. And then Park was then assassinated in 1979. And all of a sudden, there was interest in his music again. And people that had shunned him before, producers and studios who had shunned him before, were now seeking him out. And other pop stars were asking him to write, material. It's not unlike what happened to a lot of writers and actors and directors, in Hollywood during the Red Scare, that went on during the 50s and into the 60s, where you had to prove you were not a communist in order to get work. And there were a whole bunch of people that were blackballed for decades. So kind of a similar situation. You definitely can hear the influences in the different phases, and his guitar playing, as I mentioned, is just really, really incredible. As I say, you hear the styles that he is being influenced by, but he's not parroting. It's his own style, his own delivery, and it's really, really good. So I would, if you ever see it, either online or in a store, check out, it'll probably be in, if they have a section for psychedelic music, that's a good place that you might find it. Shin Joong Hyun. And, or you can find this online because this is a pretty new release. He was very much involved. He even came to the United States just a few years ago and performed during a Korean festival in, I think it was Los Angeles. And also the Yupjuns, as I said, this was re-released in its original, from the original master. I guess there were some reissues, but this one is the original master, and it also sounds really, really good. And then the other artists that he worked with, if you're interested, you can check out, who they are. Kim Sun, Kim Joo Cha, Jang Hyun, and Kim Jung Mi. There's two records here by Jang Hyun, one from 1972 and one from 1970. They had a really major falling out, I guess. Not too clear on the details, but hey, I'm talking about, Bong Joon-ho. We're talking a good subject for a biopic. Let's get on it. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you investigate this a little further. The background and the story behind a lot of music is really, really fascinating to me, which is why I like to do these episodes on, the genealogy of music. I hope you enjoyed this one. Leave some comments in the Down Under. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And always remember to enjoy your music.